I thought buying my dream mountain cabin would finally give me the peace I'd earned after 40 years of teaching rowdy teenagers. But when I opened the front door 3 months later to find my son in law Brad's parents lounging in my living room like they owned the place, sipping coffee from my grandmother's china, while Brad stood behind them with that smug grin, I realized this wasn't going to be the retirement sanctuary I'd planned. What they didn't know was that I'd prepared for exactly this moment. My name is Arlene Thompson, and at 65, I thought I'd seen every kind of manipulation imaginable. Spending 4 decades teaching high school English at Jefferson High School in Denver had exposed me to countless teenagers trying to sweet-talk their way out of assignments, parents making excuses for their children's failures, and administrators attempting to shift blame when test scores dropped. I prided myself on recognizing a con artist from 50 paces away. When my husband Walter passed 2 years ago after a brutal fight with pancreatic cancer, the life insurance payout combined with our teachers' pensions left me more financially secure than we'd ever been during our marriage. Walter had always been the careful one, insisting we maximize our retirement contributions, even when money was tight during those early teaching years. His foresight meant that at 65, I could afford to make a dramatic change. The Denver house where we'd raised our daughter Sarah held too many memories of sleepless nights during Walter's illness, too many echoes of his voice calling my name from the bedroom when the pain medication wore off too early. I needed a fresh start somewhere Walter and I had never been together, somewhere that belonged entirely to my future rather than our shared past. That's how I found myself driving through the winding mountain roads of Pine Ridge, Colorado, population 803 hours northwest of Denver. The town consisted of a single main street lined with weathered storefronts, a post office that doubled as a general store, and exactly one traffic light that blinked yellow in all directions. Most people would have considered it the middle of nowhere. To me, it looked like freedom. The cabin I bought was a foreclosure abandoned when the previous owners lost their jobs during the pandemic and couldn't keep up with payments. The bank was eager to unload it for $120,000, which seemed like a steal for 3 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, and 20 acres of pine-covered hillside with views that stretched for miles across the valley. The place needed work, certainly. The kitchen cabinets were dated, the hardwood floors needed refinishing, and the heating system required updating before winter arrived. But I'd spent summers during my college years working construction with my father's crew, and the idea of renovating the cabin myself appealed to me. Physical work would keep my hands busy while my heart finished healing. Sarah, my 38-year-old daughter, had mixed feelings about my relocation. She worried about me being alone so far from civilization, especially after losing Walter. But she also understood my need for solitude and supported my decision to sell the Denver house and start over. Her husband Brad, on the other hand, seemed unusually interested in the financial details of my cabin purchase. Brad Martinez was 41, an engineer at an aerospace company in Denver, and had been married to Sarah for 12 years. They lived in a suburban development with their 2 children, Emma and Jack, aged 8 and 10. Brad had always struck me as slightly entitled, the type of man who expected others to accommodate his preferences without question. But Sarah seemed happy with him, and he provided well for my grandchildren, so I'd kept my reservations to myself. 3 weeks after I'd signed the papers on the cabin, while I was still packing up the Denver house, Sarah called with what she presented as a family emergency. "Mom, Brad's parents are having financial troubles." She began, her voice carrying that apologetic tone I remembered from her teenage years when she was about to ask for something she knew I wouldn't want to give. "They lost their apartment lease, and their landlord is refusing to renew. They don't have anywhere to go." I'd met Frank and Dolores Martinez only a handful of times over the years. Frank was 68, a retired auto mechanic who'd worked at the same Chevrolet dealership for 30 years before the business closed. Dolores was 66, a former waitress who'd spent decades serving coffee and pie at a truck stop diner until her knees gave out. They seemed like decent enough people, though I'd always found them somewhat loud and presumptuous during family gatherings. "I'm sorry to hear that, honey," I said, genuinely sympathetic, but already sensing where this conversation was heading. "Have they looked into senior housing assistance programs? There are several good options in Denver for people their age on fixed incomes." "Well, that's the thing, Mom. Brad and I were talking, and with you having that big cabin now with 3 bedrooms, we thought maybe they could stay with you for a while, just until they get back on their feet." The request hit me like a slap across the face. I'd specifically chosen a remote mountain cabin to ensure my solitude, and now my daughter was suggesting I turn it into a boarding house for my son-in-law's parents before I'd even had a chance to settle in myself. "Sarah, this cabin is my sanctuary. I bought it specifically to have peace and quiet after everything I've been through. I'm not looking for roommates." "But Mom, they're family, and you have so much space now. It would just be temporary." I could hear the manipulation in her voice, the same guilt-inducing tone she'd used as a teenager when she wanted to borrow the car or extend her curfew. The difference was that now she was a grown woman trying to volunteer me for something I had no desire to do. "The answer is no, Sarah. If Brad's parents need a place to stay, they can stay with you and Brad. You have a guest room." There was a pause, and then I heard muffled conversation in the background before Brad's voice came on the line. His tone was different from Sarah's apologetic approach, more direct and demanding. "Look, Arlene, my parents need a place to stay and you've got room. It's the right thing to do. We're family and family helps each other out. Brad, I appreciate your situation, but this is my home. I'm not running a boarding house. Come on, you're one old woman rattling around in a big house. You're being selfish. My parents have nowhere else to go." The dismissive way he called me one old woman made my blood pressure spike. I'd been teaching since before Brad was born, owned my home outright, and had more retirement savings than most people accumulated in a lifetime. The idea that he could reduce me to a charity case who should be grateful for company infuriated me. "Brad, the answer is no. Final answer." His voice shifted again, becoming harder and more threatening. "Well, Arlene, here's the thing. My parents will be staying at your cabin. We've already told them they can move in next week. If you don't like it, you can move back to the city. That cabin's got plenty of room for people who actually need it." I felt my hands start to shake, not from fear, but from rage. In 40 years of teaching, I'd dealt with bullying students, demanding parents, and incompetent administrators, but I'd never had someone speak to me with such blatant disrespect in my own family. "Excuse me. You heard me. My parents are moving in whether you like it or not. Sarah agrees with me." I heard Sarah's voice in the background, weak and uncertain. "Brad, that's not exactly what we discussed." "Face it, Arlene." Brad continued ignoring his wife's objection. "You're one old woman in a big house in the middle of nowhere. Nobody's going to side with you over family. Stop being stubborn and accept reality." For a moment, I was too stunned to respond. The sheer audacity of his ultimatum left me speechless. He wasn't asking for a favor or even demanding one. He was informing me that he'd made a decision about my property and my life, and I was expected to comply. When I finally found my voice, it was calm and steady. "I see. Well, I suppose I can't stop you." "Exactly. I'm glad you're finally being reasonable about this. When are they planning to arrive?" "Next Friday. That gives you a week to get the place ready for them." After I hung up the phone, I sat in my half-packed Denver living room for a long time, staring at the boxes of Walter's books and the photos documenting our life together. Brad's words echoed in my mind. You're one old woman in a big house. He saw me as weak, isolated, and easy to manipulate. What Brad didn't know was that 40 years of dealing with teenage bullies had taught me exactly how to handle people who mistook kindness for weakness. He thought he'd won by intimidating me into submission. In reality, he'd just declared war on someone with decades of experience in strategic thinking and a very long memory for slights. I reached for my phone and began making calls. If Brad's parents were coming to my cabin next Friday, I needed to make sure they received the welcome they deserved. The drive from Denver to Pine Ridge took me through some of the most beautiful scenery in Colorado, but I barely noticed the aspen groves or mountain peaks during that trip. My mind was focused entirely on the problem Brad had created and the solution I intended to implement. The first stop was a visit to my neighbor Maggie Russo, who lived in the only other house visible from my cabin across the valley. Maggie was 72, a retired real estate agent who'd moved to Pine Ridge 15 years ago after her husband died. She'd been invaluable during my cabin purchase, sharing insights about the local area and helping me navigate the quirks of mountain living. Her house was a charming log structure with solar panels and a greenhouse where she grew vegetables year-round. "Arlene, I wasn't expecting to see you until next month," Maggie said, greeting me at her front door with a warm smile that faded when she saw my expression. "What's wrong, honey?" I explained Brad's ultimatum and his plans to install his parents in my cabin without my permission. Maggie's face grew increasingly grim as I described the conversation. "That's awful, Arlene. But I have to tell you something that might make this even worse." She gestured for me to sit at her kitchen table while she poured coffee from a pot that seemed perpetually brewing. "That son-in-law of yours called me 2 weeks ago. Called you about what?" "He said he was concerned about you living alone in such a remote location. He wanted to know about the property value and what he called transfer options in case something happened to you." My coffee cup froze halfway to my lips. "Transfer options." He was asking about how property ownership transfers in Colorado, specifically what happens when elderly people become unable to care for themselves. He mentioned power of attorney procedures and asked if I knew any lawyers who specialize in elder care. The implications hit me like a physical blow. Brad wasn't just trying to house his parents in my cabin, he was researching how to take it away from me entirely. "Did he say anything else?" Maggie nodded grimly and walked to her home office, returning with a folder of printed emails. "He asked me to send him information about the local market property tax assessments and zoning regulations. He also wanted to know about the nearest medical facilities and care options for elderly residents." I read through the emails, my hands trembling with rage. Brad had been systematic in his research, asking detailed questions about everything from property liens to mental competency evaluations. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment decision to help his parents. It was a calculated plan to seize my assets. "Maggie, I need to ask you for a favor. Do you still have contacts at the banks in town?" "Of course. What do you need?" An hour later, I was sitting in the Pine Ridge Community Bank with Janet Holloway, the branch manager who'd handled my mortgage paperwork. Janet was in her 50s, a no-nonsense woman who'd grown up in the area and knew everything that happened in town. "Mrs. Thompson, I'm glad you came in," Janet said after I explained my concerns about Brad. "Your son-in-law has been here twice in the past month." "Hear why?" "The first time he claimed to be your primary caregiver and wanted information about your accounts. He said you'd asked him to help manage your finances because you were getting confused about banking procedures." My mouth fell open. I never said any such thing. "I figured as much, which is why I didn't give him any information. But he was very persistent. He kept talking about protecting your interests and mentioned that you might need professional guidance with your financial decisions." "What happened the second time?" Janet's expression grew troubled. He brought an older woman with him, not his mother. She had a camera and was taking pictures of your account information on her phone while he distracted me with questions. I asked them to leave and made a note in your file about unauthorized access attempts. Do you still have the security footage from those visits? We keep everything for 90 days. I can have copies made for you. Janet walked me to the security office where we reviewed the footage from Brad's visits. Watching him point out details of my account information to his unknown accomplice while lying about his authorization made my stomach turn. This wasn't family concern. It was criminal behavior. Janet, can you tell me what specifically he was asking about during these visits? Lal, he wanted to know about competency evaluations for elderly account holders. He asked what it would take to have someone declared mentally unfit to manage their own finances and what kind of documentation the bank would need to transfer account control to a family member. The picture was becoming horrifyingly clear. Brad's plan wasn't just to house his parents in my cabin. He intended to have me declared mentally incompetent and seize control of my entire financial life. My next stop was a phone call to my lawyer, Patricia Hawkins, who'd handled Walter's will and the sale of our Denver house. Patricia had been practicing family law for 25 years and had seen every type of elder abuse imaginable. Arlene, I'm glad you called. I need to tell you about some conversations I've had with your daughter. Sarah called you 3 times in the past month. She was asking about what she called protecting your interests and intervention options for aging parents who might be making poor decisions. My heart sank. Sarah was involved in this scheme, not just passively allowing it. What kind of questions was she asking? She wanted to know about scenarios where adult children need to take control of their parents' finances for the parents' own protection. She asked about guardianship procedures, competency evaluations, and how to contest financial decisions made by elderly relatives. Did she mention any specific concerns about my mental state? She said you'd been acting differently since Walter died and mentioned that buying a remote cabin was evidence of poor judgment. She claimed you were isolating yourself and making impulsive financial decisions. The betrayal cut deeper than Brad's greed. My own daughter had been laying the groundwork to have me declared incompetent, painting my reasonable desire for solitude as evidence of mental decline. Patricia, I need you to do something for me. Can you document my mental competency with a formal evaluation? Absolutely. I know several psychiatrists who specialize in competency assessments. We'll make sure you have ironclad documentation of your mental fitness. My final stop that day was a visit to Tom Bradley, a retired police officer who'd moved to Pine Ridge and started a private investigation business. Tom was 60, a former Denver detective who specialized in financial crimes and elder abuse cases. Mrs. Thompson, I've seen cases like this before, Tom said after I explained the situation. Family members targeting elderly relatives for their assets. It's more common than people realize. Can you help me investigate what Brad's been doing? I can do better than that. I can find out if he's done this before. Tom's investigation over the next week revealed the full scope of Brad's scheming. Phone records showed months of coordination between Brad and Sarah, with calls increasing in frequency after Walter's death and my cabin purchase. Bank surveillance from Denver revealed Brad had attempted to access my accounts there as well, claiming to be my designated financial representative. Most disturbing was Tom's discovery that Frank and Dolores Martinez weren't facing eviction at all. They owned a paid-off condominium in Phoenix, where they'd been living comfortably on their combined Social Security and Frank's auto mechanic pension. The entire financial crisis was fabricated. Your son-in-law promised his parents they could retire in the mountains for free, Tom explained, showing me surveillance photos of Frank and Dolores at their Phoenix condo. He told them you'd invited them to live with you permanently and that you'd be happy to have the company. The scope of Brad's deception was staggering. He'd lied to his parents about my invitation, lied to Sarah about their financial situation, lied to bank employees about his authorization to access my accounts, and was actively researching how to have me declared incompetent so he could seize my property and assets. But Brad had made one critical error in his calculations. He assumed I was an isolated grieving widow who could be easily manipulated and discarded. He didn't realize that 40 years of dealing with scheming teenagers had taught me exactly how to outmaneuver someone who thought they were smarter than everyone else. By the end of that week, I had everything I needed to destroy his plans completely. But first, I was going to let him think he'd won. Returning to Denver from my reconnaissance trip to Pine Ridge, I felt like a general preparing for battle. Brad's scheme was far more elaborate and malicious than I'd initially suspected, but his overconfidence would become his downfall. The key was maintaining my facade of resigned compliance while methodically building an unbreakable case against him. My first call was to my neighbor's grandson, Tyler, a 22-year-old computer science student who'd helped me set up my internet and streaming services when I bought the cabin. Tyler specialized in home security systems and had been looking for a summer job. "Mrs. Thompson, you want me to install what?" Tyler asked when I explained my requirements. "A comprehensive surveillance system throughout the cabin. Hidden cameras in every room, audio recording equipment that looks like normal household items, and a monitoring system I can access remotely from my phone or computer." Tyler's eyes lit up with the enthusiasm of a young man being asked to play with expensive toys. "We're talking about some serious equipment here. Professional-grade stuff that records in high definition and stores everything in the cloud. Are you sure about the budget?" "Money is no object. I want to document everything that happens in that cabin from the moment Brad's parents arrive." Over the next 3 days, Tyler transformed my cabin into a sophisticated surveillance center. Cameras were hidden inside smoke detectors, wall clocks, and picture frames. Audio equipment was disguised as vintage radio speakers and decorative objects. The entire system was controlled by a smartphone app that would alert me whenever motion was detected and automatically upload all recordings to a secure cloud server. "The beauty of this system," Tyler explained as he demonstrated the controls, "is that it's completely invisible. Unless someone knows exactly what to look for, they'll never spot the cameras. And even if they find one or two there are backups they'll never locate." While Tyler worked on the surveillance system, I focused on legal preparations with Patricia Hawkins. We spent hours crafting documents that would make my property and assets impossible for Brad to seize through any legal mechanism. "The trust structure we're creating makes you the sole beneficiary during your lifetime," Patricia explained as we reviewed the paperwork. "The property can't be transferred without court approval and documentation of genuine incapacity, not just someone's opinion that you're making poor decisions." We also arranged for comprehensive mental competency evaluations with 2 different psychiatrists, creating a paper trail that would demolish any attempt to claim I was suffering from dementia or poor judgment. The evaluations included cognitive tests, personality assessments, and detailed interviews about my decision-making processes. Dr. Elizabeth Crane, the first psychiatrist, was particularly thorough in her assessment. "Mrs. Thompson, your cognitive function is well above average for your age group. Your decision to relocate after your husband's death shows healthy adaptation to life changes, not impaired judgment." The second evaluation with Dr. Michael Santos focused specifically on financial competency. "Your understanding of your financial situation, investment strategies, and property management is sophisticated and well-reasoned. Any suggestion that you lack capacity to manage your own affairs would be completely unfounded." With my legal protections in place, I turned to the more creative aspects of my preparation. I needed Brad to believe his plan was working while I gathered evidence of his criminal behavior. During phone calls with Sarah and Brad, I began acting slightly confused and overwhelmed. I mentioned forgetting where I'd put important documents and expressed concern about managing the cabin maintenance on my own. I complained about feeling isolated and suggested I might have made a mistake buying such a remote property. Brad's excitement grew with each conversation. He began offering to help me manage my finances and suggested I might be more comfortable in a senior living facility where I could have proper supervision. "Arlene, you don't need to struggle with all this responsibility," he said during one particularly manipulative phone call. "Let me take care of the hard stuff so you can just relax and enjoy your retirement." "I don't know, Brad. Sometimes I feel like I'm in over my head with this place." "That's completely normal for someone your age. The important thing is recognizing when you need help and accepting it from family who cares about you." Each conversation was secretly recorded, adding to my growing collection of evidence documenting Brad's predatory behavior. Meanwhile, I planted false information designed to increase his greed and rush his timeline. During a deliberately confused phone call, I mentioned that Walter's aunt had left me an inheritance I was having trouble understanding. An inheritance? What kind of inheritance, Arlene? Something about stocks and bonds? The lawyer keeps calling about paperwork, but it's all so complicated. Walter always handled the financial stuff. How much are we talking about? I think he said something about $200,000, but I can't remember if that's before or after taxes. I'm supposed to sign some documents, but I keep putting it off because I don't understand them. The hook was set. Within hours, Tom Bradley's surveillance equipment detected Brad making frantic phone calls to financial advisors, asking about inheritance procedures and tax implications for large windfalls. While Brad salivated over my fictional inheritance, I made final preparations at the cabin. I hired local contractors to make specific modifications that would serve my purposes perfectly. They installed a secondary electrical system with hidden shutoffs I could control, remotely created false walls with storage space for important documents, and set up a separate internet connection that wouldn't appear on regular service provider records. The piece de resistance was my welcome surprise for Frank and Dolores. Working with a local attorney who specialized in property law, I prepared documentation that would make their arrival at my cabin legally problematic from the moment they crossed the threshold. "This is brilliant," Patricia said when I explained my strategy. "They'll be committing criminal trespass the moment they enter the property with intent to establish residence without your permission. And Brad will be guilty of conspiracy and fraud for facilitating their illegal occupation." Exactly. Plus all the bank fraud, identity theft, and attempted elder abuse charges we're building. The final element of my preparation involved enlisting community support. Pine Ridge was a small town where everyone knew everyone, and word of my situation had spread quickly through Maggie's network of local contacts. The response was overwhelmingly supportive. Sheriff Duncan Maxwell, a 20-year veteran of mountain law enforcement, stopped by the cabin during my final preparation week. "Mrs. Thompson, Maggie filled me in on what's happening here. I want you to know we're watching this situation closely." "I appreciate that, Sheriff. Elder abuse and property fraud are serious crimes in Colorado. If your son-in-law thinks he can pull something like this in my jurisdiction, he's about to learn otherwise." By Friday morning, 1 week after Brad's ultimatum, everything was in place. The surveillance system was operational, legal documents were filed, evidence was securely stored in multiple locations, and the community was prepared to support my response to Brad's invasion. I spent Thursday night at a motel in the nearby town of Copper Falls, 20 miles from Pine Ridge. From my room, I could monitor the cabin's surveillance system on my laptop, while maintaining the appearance of being too overwhelmed to handle Frank and Dolores' arrival. At 8 o'clock Friday morning, I called Sarah in tears. "Honey, I can't do this. I can't handle having Brad's parents in the house. I'm going to stay at a motel until they get settled, and then maybe I'll look into that senior living place Brad mentioned. Sarah's voice was conflicted, torn between guilt over her husband's manipulation and relief that the confrontation was being avoided. Mom, are you sure? Maybe if we all sit down and talk. No, it's fine. Brad's right. I'm probably too old to be living alone out here anyway. Tell Frank and Dolores they can make themselves comfortable. I just need some time to adjust to the idea. Brad got on the phone, barely able to contain his excitement. Arlene, I think you're making the right choice. My parents will take good care of the place while you figure out your next steps. I'm sure they will, Brad. I'm sure they will. What Brad didn't know was that every word of our conversation was being recorded, adding to the mountain of evidence, documenting his conspiracy to defraud an elderly widow. And in a few hours, when Frank and Dolores arrived at my cabin, expecting to be welcomed as permanent residents, they would discover that some welcomes come with handcuffs. Friday morning dawned crisp and clear in the Colorado mountains' perfect weather for what was about to become the most satisfying day of my 65 years. From my motel room in Copper Falls, I watched the cabin's surveillance feeds on my laptop while sipping coffee and waiting for the show to begin. At 10:30, a U-Haul truck followed by a silver sedan wound up the mountain road toward my property. Through the hidden cameras, I watched Frank Martinez climb out of the truck's passenger seat, stretching his back and surveying the property with obvious satisfaction. Dolores emerged from the sedan looking around with the proprietary air of someone who already considered herself the lady of the house. What struck me most was how prepared they were. This wasn't the desperate scramble of people facing sudden homelessness. They'd packed systematically, bringing furniture, artwork, and enough personal belongings to establish permanent residence. The U-Haul was nearly full, suggesting they'd been planning this move for weeks. Through the surveillance system's audio, I heard Frank's voice clearly as he walked around the cabin's exterior. This place is even better than Brad described. Look at all this land, Dolores. We'll have room for that garden you've been wanting. The view is incredible, Dolores replied, shading her eyes as she looked across the valley toward Maggie's house. And so private. We won't have any neighbors bothering us. They used the key Brad had somehow obtained, probably copied from Sarah's set during one of their family visits. I made a mental note to add illegal key duplication to the growing list of charges being compiled against my son-in-law. The hidden cameras captured everything as Frank and Dolores entered my home and began claiming territory like conquering invaders. Within minutes, they were pulling dust covers off my furniture and critiquing my decorating choices. This old-fashioned stuff has got to go, Dolores announced, running her finger along my grandmother's antique sideboard with obvious distaste. We'll put our entertainment center where that ugly cabinet is sitting. The master bedroom's bigger than I expected, Frank called from down the hallway. Our king-size bed will fit perfectly. I watched in growing fury as they began systematically removing my personal belongings from the master bedroom and carrying them to the smallest guest room. Walter's reading chair, the one where he'd spent his final months when walking became too difficult, was unceremoniously shoved into a corner. The quilt my mother had made for our wedding was stripped from the bed and tossed onto a pile of discarded linens. Most heartbreaking was watching Dolores handle Walter's photograph on the nightstand, studying it with curious detachment before placing it face down in a cardboard box marked Arlene stuff. Brad said she's got some kind of inheritance coming, Dolores said to Frank as they rearranged my bedroom to suit their preferences. 200,000 or something like that. Good thing we're here to help her manage it, Frank replied with a laugh that made my blood boil. Woman her age living alone, probably getting confused about financial matters. She needs family looking out for her interests. The hidden cameras captured hours of similar conversations as Frank and Dolores settled into my home with the entitlement of people who believed they'd inherited a mountain estate. They discussed renovations they wanted to make, furniture they planned to buy, and improvements to the property that would increase the value for when we inherit it. By afternoon, they'd completely transformed my master bedroom and living room to suit their tastes. My carefully chosen mountain cabin decor was replaced with their garish Arizona retirement community aesthetic. Family photos spanning decades were packed away and replaced with their own pictures and artwork. The surveillance audio picked up their phone call to Brad around 4 o'clock. "Son, this place is perfect," Frank reported. "Arlene's gone to some motel, so we've got the whole place to ourselves. The old lady left everything nice and clean for us." "Great." Brad's voice came through clearly on the speakerphone. "Any problems with neighbors or anything?" "I haven't seen a soul. There's another house across the valley, but it's got to be a mile away. We could have a brass band out here and nobody would hear us." "Perfect. Mom, how are you settling in?" Dolores took the phone with obvious excitement. "Bradley, you should see this place. It's like something from one of those home and garden magazines, and so much room for our things. We're going to be very comfortable here. Just remember, this is temporary until we can work out the permanent arrangements. Arlene's having some confusion issues lately, so we need to be patient while we help her transition to a more appropriate living situation." I nearly threw my laptop across the motel room. Brad was coaching his parents to support his lies about my mental competency, preparing them to serve as witnesses in his campaign to have me declared unfit. "Don't worry about us, son," Frank assured him. "We'll take good care of everything until you can get the legal stuff sorted out. This property's going to be worth a fortune someday, especially with all the development happening in these mountain towns." Saturday brought Brad himself, arriving with a carload of measuring equipment and renovation catalogs. The hidden cameras captured him walking through the property with the focused attention of someone conducting a real estate appraisal. He measured rooms, photographed architectural details, and made extensive notes about potential improvements. The audio surveillance picked up his phone call to a local contractor about installing a hot tub and expanding the deck. He spoke with the authority of an owner, never mentioning that the property belonged to someone else or that his modifications would need permission. Most damning was his conversation with Frank and Dolores about the timeline for his plans. The inheritance money should be available within 60 days, Brad explained as they sat around my kitchen table eating lunch. Once that's in hand, we'll have Arlene evaluated by a psychiatrist who understands these kinds of situations. "What kind of psychiatrist?" Dolores asked. "Someone who specializes in age-related cognitive decline. There are doctors who understand that sometimes family members need to step in and make difficult decisions for elderly relatives who can't see that they need help." Frank nodded approvingly. "The poor woman's obviously struggling since her husband died. Living alone in a place like this isn't safe for someone her age." "Exactly. The evaluation will show that she needs professional care in a controlled environment. Once we have guardianship established, we can make sure she gets the help she needs while protecting her assets from poor financial decisions." I stared at the laptop screen in amazement. Brad was openly discussing his plan to bribe a psychiatrist for a false diagnosis that would justify seizing my assets and having me committed. The arrogance was breathtaking. Sunday brought the most disturbing revelation yet. While reviewing the overnight surveillance footage, I discovered Brad had made additional phone calls from my cabin, including one to a private care facility in Grand Junction. "Dr. Walsh, this is Brad Martinez. We discussed my mother-in-law's situation last month. Yes, she's the elderly widow with the property transfer issues. The family's ready to move forward with placement. We'll need a bed available within the next 60 days for someone requiring full-time supervision due to cognitive decline and financial incompetency." The facility director's voice was clearly audible through the speakerphone. Mr. Martinez, as I mentioned during our previous conversation, we specialize in discreet long-term care for elderly clients whose families need to maintain control over their financial affairs. Our monthly fees include medical supervision and regular psychiatric evaluations that support ongoing guardianship requirements. Perfect. The patient will arrive with a recent competency evaluation showing diminished capacity and family concern about safety issues. We'll need your staff to reinforce these findings in their ongoing assessments. Of course, we understand the importance of consistent documentation in these family protection cases. I sat frozen in my motel room listening to my son-in-law arrange for my imprisonment in a corrupt care facility that would falsify medical records to support his theft of my property. This wasn't just greed or opportunism. It was a calculated conspiracy to destroy my life and freedom. But Brad had made a critical error. His overwhelming confidence had led him to discuss his criminal plans openly while standing in a house equipped with professional surveillance equipment that was recording everything in high definition and uploading it automatically to secure servers he didn't know existed. By Sunday evening, I had 48 hours of video and audio evidence documenting conspiracy to commit elder fraud, identity theft, property theft, and false imprisonment. Frank and Dolores had incriminated themselves as willing participants, and Brad had provided detailed confessions to multiple felonies. Monday morning, I made a final phone call to Brad, maintaining my confused and defeated persona one last time. Brad, I've been thinking about what you said regarding living arrangements. Maybe you're right about me needing more supervision. Arlene, I'm glad you're finally seeing this clearly. It's going to be better for everyone, especially you. I'd like to come back to the cabin and talk with your parents about how this arrangement might work. Of course. They're very understanding about these kinds of transitions. They'll help you feel more comfortable about making necessary changes. I'll be there this afternoon around 2 o'clock. Will you be able to join us? Absolutely. Sarah and I will both be there. This is going to work out perfectly for everyone. I'm sure it will, Brad. I'm sure it will. After hanging up, I made 3 more phone calls. The first was to Sheriff Maxwell, the second to Tom Bradley, and the third to Patricia Hawkins. It's time I told each of them. Bring the handcuffs. Monday afternoon arrived with the crisp clarity that only mountain air can provide. As I drove up the winding road toward my cabin, I felt the calm determination of someone about to administer long overdue justice. Tom Bradley followed in his pickup truck, while Sheriff Maxwell and Deputy Rosa Martinez took a different route to approach the property from the back road. Patricia Hawkins had coordinated with the district attorney's office to ensure arrest warrants would be ready the moment we presented our evidence. The plan was precise: confront the conspirators, present the surveillance evidence, and watch their world collapse in real time. I parked in my usual spot beside the cabin, noting that Frank and Dolores had already replaced my welcome mat with one that read, "The Martinez Family." The audacity was stunning even after everything I'd witnessed through the hidden cameras. Tom Bradley positioned himself near the tree line where he could photograph everything while remaining out of sight. Through my earpiece, I heard Sheriff Maxwell confirm that he and Deputy Martinez were in position behind the cabin. I knocked on my own front door, a gesture that felt both surreal and symbolically appropriate. Frank answered, looking surprised but not particularly concerned. Arlene, Brad said you might stop by. Come in, come in. Dolores and I have been taking good care of the place. The interior of my cabin looked like a different house. My carefully chosen furniture had been replaced or rearranged beyond recognition. Family photos spanning 40 years were gone, replaced with pictures of Frank and Dolores at various Arizona vacation spots. The coffee table held real estate magazines and contractor brochures, evidence of their renovation plans. I see you've made yourselves comfortable, I said mildly, pulling out my phone to activate the recording app. Oh, we hope you don't mind. Dolores called from the kitchen where she was preparing lunch using my dishes and groceries I hadn't purchased. "We wanted everything to be nice for when you came back. Brad explained about your situation, and we're happy to help during this difficult time." My situation. Frank settled into Walter's reading chair, which he'd moved to a different corner and covered with a garish throw pillow. "You know the memory issues and confusion about finances. Brad told us you've been struggling since Walter died." The casual way he discussed my supposed mental decline while sitting in my husband's chair made my hands clench, but I maintained my composed expression. "I see. And what exactly did Brad tell you about my memory issues?" "Nothing to be embarrassed about," Dolores assured me, emerging from the kitchen with a sandwich made from my food. "Lots of people your age have trouble keeping track of complicated things like property management and financial planning. That's what family is for." Before I could respond, Brad's voice called from the driveway. "Arlene, are you here?" He entered through the front door without knocking, followed by Sarah, who looked uncomfortable and avoided making eye contact. Brad's confidence was immediately apparent in his posture and tone. "Arlene, you look better. I was worried about you staying alone in that motel. This is much better having family around to help you think through your options." "Yes, your parents have been very helpful in explaining my situation to me." Brad's smile was patronizing in a way that made my teeth ache. "Good. I know this is a big adjustment, but it's really for the best. Sarah and I have been researching facilities that specialize in helping people like you maintain their independence while getting the support they need. People like me. Elderly individuals dealing with the confusion and isolation that comes after losing a spouse. There's no shame in admitting you need help managing complicated decisions." Sarah finally spoke, her voice tight with tension. "Mom, Brad thinks there might be some good options closer to Denver where we could visit more often." The trap was set perfectly. All the participants were present, and Brad was doubling down on his lies about my mental state, while his parents nodded in support of his fictional narrative. I pulled out my phone and opened the surveillance app, selecting one of the most incriminating recordings from Saturday afternoon. "Before we discuss my future living arrangements, I'd like you to hear something interesting." Brad's voice filled the cabin crystal clear through my phone's speaker. "The inheritance money should be available within 60 days. Once that's in hand, we'll have Arlene evaluated by a psychiatrist who understands these kinds of situations." The room fell dead silent except for the recorded conversation continuing to play. Frank's face went pale as he heard his own voice responding, the poor woman's obviously struggling since her husband died. Brad lunged for my phone, but I stepped back smoothly, having anticipated his reaction. "Don't worry, Brad. I have copies stored in multiple secure locations. Would you like to hear the part where you arrange my imprisonment in that corrupt care facility?" Sarah's face crumpled as the full scope of her husband's deception became clear. "Brad, what is she talking about?" I selected another recording, this one from Sunday morning. Dr. Walsh's voice echoed through the cabin. "Mr. Martinez, we specialize in discreet long-term care for elderly clients whose families need to maintain control over their financial affairs." "Oh my God," Sarah whispered, staring at her husband in horror. "Brad, what have you done?" Brad's composure finally cracked. "It's not what it sounds like. I was protecting Arlene from making bad decisions. She's isolated and confused, and she needs family to help her. By having me declared mentally incompetent and stealing my property," I asked calmly. "You are mentally incompetent," Brad shouted, his mask finally slipping completely. "You're a lonely old woman living in the middle of nowhere, and you're too stubborn to admit you need help. Someone had to take control before you lost everything." Frank and Dolores began backing toward the door, finally understanding that they'd been caught red-handed in a criminal conspiracy. "Now wait just a minute," Frank protested weakly. "Brad told us you'd invited us to stay here. He said you needed company and help around the house." I played another recording, this one from their first day in the cabin. Brad said she's got some kind of inheritance coming. 200,000 or something like that. Dolores's voice continued on the recording. Good thing we're here to help her manage it. That doesn't sound like people who thought they were invited guests, I observed. That sounds like people planning to steal from an elderly widow. Sarah was crying now, the full betrayal hitting her as she listened to her husband discussing her mother like a target to be exploited. How could you do this? She's my mother. I did this for us, Brad snapped. For our family's future, your mother has more money than she could spend in 3 lifetimes, and she's wasting it on this ridiculous cabin fantasy. Our kids could have used that inheritance for college for their future. By having my mother committed to steal her money, by making sure she gets appropriate care while preserving the family assets. The sound of vehicles in the driveway interrupted Brad's desperate justifications. Through the window, I could see Sheriff Maxwell and Deputy Martinez approaching the front door while Tom Bradley emerged from the tree line with his camera equipment. Arlene, what's going on? Brad demanded, finally realizing that his situation was far worse than a family argument. I walked to the front door and opened it wide, gesturing for the sheriff to enter. Sheriff Maxwell, thank you for coming. I believe you'll find everything we discussed is exactly as documented. Sheriff Maxwell was a tall, weathered man in his 50s who'd spent decades dealing with mountain crime. He surveyed the room with the calm authority of someone accustomed to tense situations. Frank and Dolores Martinez, you're under arrest for criminal trespass, conspiracy to commit elder fraud, and theft of personal property. Wait, what? Dolores shrieked. We didn't steal anything. Ma'am, you've been living in Mrs. Thompson's home without permission for 4 days, removed her personal belongings, and participated in a conspiracy to defraud her of her property. That constitutes multiple felonies under Colorado law. Deputy Martinez began reading them their rights, while Sheriff Maxwell turned to Brad. Mr. Martinez, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit elder fraud, identity theft, attempted bank fraud, and conspiracy to commit false imprisonment. Brad's face went white. This is insane. I'm trying to protect my family. Sir, we have extensive audio and video evidence of your criminal conspiracy, including recordings of your attempts to bribe medical professionals and arrange fraudulent psychiatric evaluations. You have the right to remain silent. As the handcuffs clicked around Brad's wrists, he looked at Sarah with desperate eyes. Sarah, you know I love you. Everything I did was for our family. Sarah stepped back, shaking her head. No, Brad. Everything you did was to Brad. You were going to destroy my mother's life for money. Tom Bradley approached me with a satisfied smile, his camera having captured everything for additional evidence. Mrs. Thompson, I think we've got enough documentation here to put this case away permanently. Patricia Hawkins arrived as the deputies were loading Frank and Dolores into the patrol car. She carried a thick folder of legal documents and wore the expression of an attorney who'd been looking forward to this moment. Arlene, the district attorney, is very interested in this case. Elder fraud conspiracies are a priority prosecution area, and the evidence you've gathered is overwhelming. As the patrol cars disappeared down the mountain road, taking Brad and his parents toward a future that would include prison sentences and financial ruin, I stood on my cabin's front porch with Sarah and surveyed the property I'd successfully defended. Mom, I'm so sorry, Sarah said through tears. I should have known what Brad was really planning. Honey, he manipulated you just like he tried to manipulate me. The difference is that I had 40 years of experience dealing with teenage con artists. Sarah laughed despite her tears. I should have remembered that you never let anyone get away with anything in your classroom. Some lessons from teaching apply to retirement too, I said, putting my arm around my daughter's shoulders. Like never let a bully think they can intimidate you into giving up what's rightfully yours. As the sun set behind the mountains, casting golden light across the valley, I felt the deep satisfaction that comes from a battle well fought and decisively won. But this was only the beginning. Brad's arrest was just the first step in a legal process that would ensure he never threatened another elderly person again. The week following Brad's arrest brought a cascade of consequences that exceeded even my most optimistic expectations. Tom Bradley's investigation had uncovered a web of criminal activity that extended far beyond the conspiracy against me, and law enforcement agencies across Colorado were now involved in what had become a major elder fraud case. On Tuesday morning, Patricia Hawkins called with an update that made me smile over my coffee. Arlene, the bank fraud investigation has expanded. Brad attempted to access elderly accounts at 3 different banks using the same tactics he tried with you. He's facing federal charges now, not just state ones. Federal charges: wire fraud, identity theft across state lines, and conspiracy to violate federal elder protection statutes. We're talking about potential sentences of 15 to 20 years in federal prison. The FBI had seized Brad's computers and discovered files containing personal information on dozens of elderly individuals in Colorado and Arizona. His scheme wasn't limited to family members. He'd been researching vulnerable seniors throughout the region, identifying those with substantial assets and limited family support. Sheriff Maxwell stopped by the cabin Wednesday afternoon to provide additional details about the investigation. Mrs. Thompson, your son-in-law, was running what we call a predatory caregiving operation. He'd identify elderly targets, research their financial situations, then manipulate family members into supporting guardianship petitions that would give him control over their assets. How many other families were involved? We've identified at least 12 cases where he made preliminary contact with elderly individuals or their family members. Your case was the most advanced, but there were others in various stages of development. The scope of Brad's criminal enterprise was staggering. He'd spent months developing relationships with corrupt medical professionals, elder care facilities, and legal representatives who would support false competency evaluations in exchange for kickbacks from the seized assets. Dr. Walsh's care facility in Grand Junction was shut down pending investigation, and 3 psychiatrists were facing ethics violations for their willingness to provide fraudulent evaluations. The entire network of enablers that made Brad's scheme possible was collapsing under federal scrutiny. Frank and Dolores's situation became increasingly desperate as the reality of their legal exposure sank in. Unlike Brad, who maintained his innocence despite overwhelming evidence, they quickly accepted responsibility and began cooperating with investigators. Mrs. Thompson, Frank said during a phone call from jail, his voice shaking with shame. Dolores and I want you to know how sorry we are. We thought Brad was telling the truth about you inviting us to stay. We never meant to participate in anything criminal. Their attorney had negotiated a plea agreement that would result in suspended sentences and community service in exchange for their testimony against Brad. They would also be required to pay restitution for the damage to my personal belongings and the cost of restoring my cabin to its original condition. We've lost everything, Dolores added tearfully. Our savings are gone for legal fees, and we'll have to sell our condo in Phoenix to pay the restitution. But we deserve it for what we put you through. While I felt some sympathy for their situation, I couldn't forget the callous way they discussed my supposed inheritance or their enthusiastic participation in Brad's plans to have me committed. Age and manipulation by their son didn't excuse their willingness to profit from my destruction. The most satisfying development came Thursday morning when Patricia called with news about Brad's employment situation. His engineering firm terminated him immediately after his arrest. Apparently, they discovered he'd been using company resources to research elderly clients and had accessed confidential employee records to identify potential targets among retirees with company pension plans. Brad's professional reputation was destroyed overnight. Word of his arrest spread quickly through Denver's engineering community, ensuring he'd never work in his field again. His state professional license was suspended pending the outcome of his criminal case, and the Engineering Society was conducting its own ethics investigation. Sarah's divorce proceedings moved forward with unprecedented speed. With overwhelming evidence of Brad's criminal behavior and financial deception, no judge would consider anything other than complete asset forfeiture and permanent loss of parental rights. "Mom, I found out Brad had been lying to me about our finances for years," Sarah told me during one of our daily phone calls. "We're not struggling with money like he claimed. He's been hiding income and assets, probably planning to use them for his schemes." Sarah had discovered that Brad owned rental properties in Arizona she hadn't known about, maintained secret bank accounts, and had been systematically deceiving her about their financial situation. The revelation that her entire marriage had been built on lies was devastating, but also liberating. "I keep thinking about how he manipulated me into supporting his lies about your mental state," she said. "He convinced me you were making poor decisions and needed family intervention. I actually believed him when he said we were protecting you." "Honey, that's what manipulators do. They use our love against us, making us feel like we're helping when we're actually enabling harm." The financial ruin Brad faced was comprehensive and irreversible. His house was seized to pay legal fees, restitution, and civil penalties. His retirement accounts were frozen pending the resolution of asset forfeiture proceedings. Every investment savings account and valuable possession was being liquidated to compensate his victims and pay the costs of prosecution. But the destruction went beyond finances. Brad's arrest made national news as an example of sophisticated elder fraud targeting family members. His photograph appeared in newspapers and television reports, forever associating his name with criminal exploitation of seniors. The social consequences were equally devastating. Friends and colleagues abandoned him as the details of his crimes became public. His children would grow up knowing their father was a convicted felon who had tried to destroy their grandmother for money. The family name he'd worked decades to establish was permanently tainted. Friday brought the most unexpected development of all. During a jailhouse interview with investigators, Brad finally broke down and confessed to additional crimes that hadn't been discovered. He admitted to insurance fraud involving his father-in-law's death, Sheriff Maxwell reported. He filed false claims for medical equipment and services that were never provided during Walter's final illness. The admission opened new avenues for prosecution and additional restitution claims. Brad had been stealing from Walter's memory even as he planned to destroy mine, a level of heartless greed that shocked even experienced investigators. "There's more," the sheriff continued. "He's been running investment scams targeting elderly clients of the engineering firm where he worked. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of dollars in losses across multiple victims." Each revelation added years to Brad's potential sentence and increased the financial devastation facing him and anyone who'd supported his schemes. What had started as a conspiracy against one elderly widow had exposed a criminal enterprise that had destroyed multiple families across 2 states. The corrupt network Brad had assembled was collapsing systematically. Dr. Walsh faced federal charges for Medicare fraud, in addition to his role in the elder abuse conspiracy. The psychiatrists who had agreed to provide false evaluations were losing their medical licenses and facing criminal prosecution. Even the lawyers who had facilitated illegal guardianship petitions were under investigation by their state bar associations. By the end of the week, Brad was facing charges that carried a combined potential sentence of more than 30 years in federal prison. His co-conspirators were either pleading guilty to reduced charges in exchange for testimony or facing their own lengthy sentences. The entire criminal enterprise had been dismantled, and its victims were beginning the process of recovering their stolen assets. Saturday evening, I sat on my cabin's front porch with a glass of wine, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple. The silence was profound and peaceful, broken only by the evening calls of mountain birds and the distant sound of wind through pine trees. My phone rang and I saw Sarah's name on the caller ID. "Mom, I wanted to thank you for protecting not just yourself, but me and the kids too. If Brad's plan had worked, he would have destroyed all of us eventually. Honey, protecting family is what mothers do, even when family members can't see the danger themselves. I've been thinking about moving to Pine Ridge permanently. The kids need a fresh start, and I need to be closer to you after everything that's happened." The idea of having Sarah and my grandchildren nearby was more appealing than I'd expected. The cabin had been designed as a solitary retreat, but perhaps it could become something better, a home, where 3 generations could heal together while building new traditions. "I'd like that very much," I said, watching the last light fade from the mountain peaks. "This place has room for new beginnings." As I hung up the phone and prepared to go inside, I felt the deep satisfaction that comes from a battle not just won, but decisively concluded. Brad's scheme had been not just defeated, but turned against him so completely that he would never recover from the consequences. But more importantly, I'd protected not just my own future, but the future of my family. Sarah and the children would build new lives free from Brad's manipulation and greed. And I would spend my remaining years knowing that I'd faced down a predator and emerged victorious. The mountain night settled around the cabin, peaceful and secure. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities, but tonight was for savoring the victory of an old teacher who had taught her final and most important lesson: never underestimate the power of careful preparation and righteous anger. 6 months after Brad's arrest, the legal proceedings had concluded with outcomes that exceeded every expectation for justice. The federal courthouse in Denver had become the site of one of the largest elder fraud prosecutions in Colorado history, with ramifications that would protect vulnerable seniors throughout the region for years to come. Brad's sentencing hearing drew overflow crowds of elderly victims' family members and advocacy groups who had followed the case through months of revelations about predatory schemes targeting seniors. Judge Catherine Morrison, a 20-year veteran of federal criminal law, delivered a sentence that sent shockwaves through the criminal community. "Mr. Martinez, your crimes represent a calculated assault on some of our society's most vulnerable members," Judge Morrison declared, as Brad stood before the bench in Orange Jail, clothing his appearance haggard from months of incarceration. "You exploited family relationships, manipulated medical professionals, and corrupted legal processes in pursuit of personal gain. This court sentences you to 18 years in federal prison without possibility of parole." The sentence was longer than even Patricia had predicted, reflecting the judge's determination to send a message about elder fraud prosecutions. Brad would serve his time in a high-security facility far from Colorado, ensuring he could never again threaten elderly residents of the state. Frank and Dolores received suspended sentences and 5 years of supervised probation in exchange for their cooperation and testimony. They were required to perform 800 hours of community service at senior centers, educating elderly residents about fraud prevention. Their financial restitution to me totaled $85,000, representing every asset they possessed after selling their Phoenix condominium. "Mrs. Thompson will spend the rest of our lives trying to make up for what we did to you," Dolores said during the sentencing, hearing tears streaming down her face as she addressed me directly. "We were greedy and selfish, and we're ashamed of how we treated your home and your memory of Walter." Frank nodded in agreement, his voice barely audible. "We hope someday you might be able to forgive us. We know we don't deserve it, but we're genuinely sorry for the pain we caused." Their remorse seemed genuine, and while I couldn't forget their eager participation in Brad's scheme, I appreciated their acceptance of responsibility. Unlike their son, they had acknowledged their crimes and attempted to make amends. The corrupt medical professionals faced their own consequences. Dr. Walsh received a 12-year sentence for Medicare fraud and conspiracy charges, while his fraudulent care facility was permanently closed and its assets liquidated to compensate victims. The 3 psychiatrists who had agreed to provide false evaluations lost their medical licenses and received suspended sentences contingent on performing professional rehabilitation work. The broader impact of the case extended throughout Colorado's elder care system. The state legislature passed new laws strengthening penalties for elder fraud and requiring additional oversight of guardianship proceedings. Banks implemented enhanced security protocols for elderly account holders, and law enforcement agencies created specialized elder abuse units. Sarah's divorce was finalized with a settlement that awarded her complete custody of Emma and Jack, along with all marital assets remaining after Brad's criminal restitution payments. She'd found employment as a 4th-grade teacher at Pine Ridge Elementary School, a position that allowed her to build a new life in the mountains while staying close to me. "Mom, I never realized how beautiful it is here until I started living here full-time," Sarah said as we worked together in my garden on a bright Saturday morning in late spring. "The kids are thriving in a small school environment, and I feel like I can breathe again." Emma and Jack, now 9 and 11, had adjusted remarkably well to their new circumstances. They spent most weekends at the cabin helping with outdoor projects and exploring the hiking trails that crisscrossed the mountainside. The trauma of their father's crimes was being healed through stability, honesty, and the unconditional love of family who valued them for themselves rather than as pawns in financial schemes. "Grandma Arlene, will you tell us again about how you caught the bad guys?" Emma asked during one of our evening story sessions on the front porch. Despite the serious subject matter, she found the tale endlessly fascinating as an example of good triumphing over evil. "The most important thing to remember," I told her watching Jack catch fireflies in the gathering dusk, "is that bad people count on good people being too polite or scared to fight back. But sometimes you have to stand up for yourself even when it's difficult." "Especially when it's difficult," Jack added, having heard this lesson multiple times. At 11, he was old enough to understand that his father had been genuinely dangerous and that my actions had protected the entire family. The financial recovery from Brad's crimes had been substantial. In addition to the restitution payments, civil lawsuits against his criminal network had resulted in additional compensation for the time, stress, and emotional damage caused by his scheme. The money wasn't the point, but it provided security and peace of mind for the future. More importantly, the cabin had become exactly the sanctuary I'd envisioned when I first bought it. The surveillance equipment had been removed and replaced with security systems designed for protection rather than evidence gathering. The rooms once occupied by Frank and Dolores had been converted into comfortable spaces for Sarah and the children during their visits. My garden flourished in the mountain soil, producing vegetables that I shared with neighbors throughout Pine Ridge. The community had embraced me as not just a resident, but as an advocate for elderly rights and fraud prevention. I taught monthly workshops at the senior center, sharing the lessons learned from my confrontation with Brad and helping other seniors recognize warning signs of exploitation. Mrs. Thompson, your story probably prevented dozens of other families from going through what you experienced, said Margaret Collins, director of the Pine Ridge Senior Center during a community appreciation dinner held in my honor. You've turned a personal tragedy into a teaching opportunity that protects everyone. The recognition was gratifying, but the real satisfaction came from quieter moments, morning coffee on the front porch, evening walks with Sarah and the grandchildren, and the deep sleep that comes from knowing you've faced your worst fears and emerged victorious. Tom Bradley had expanded his private investigation business based on referrals from the elder fraud case. He now specialized in financial crimes against seniors and had prevented several schemes similar to Brad's before they could fully develop. Arlene, you taught me that seniors aren't helpless victims waiting to be exploited, Tom said during one of his regular check-in visits. You're often the most experienced and resourceful people in any situation if others are smart enough to listen to your wisdom. Maggie Russo had become my closest friend and most frequent companion for hiking shopping trips to Denver and long conversations about mountain living. At 72, she possessed energy and curiosity that inspired my own approach to aging actively and purposefully. I've lived in Pine Ridge for 15 years, and nothing's ever been as exciting as watching you take down those criminals. Maggie laughed during one of our weekly coffee sessions. It was better than any movie I've ever seen. The peaceful rhythm of mountain life suited me perfectly. Days were filled with reading, gardening, volunteer work, and time with family. Evenings were reserved for reflection, correspondence with friends, and planning new projects that would make retirement meaningful and productive. 1 year after Brad's sentencing, I received an unexpected phone call from the Colorado State Attorney General's office. Mrs. Thompson, we'd like to invite you to speak at our annual conference on elder protection. Your case has become a model for how seniors can protect themselves from financial predators, and we'd value your perspective on prevention strategies. The speaking engagement led to others, and I found myself with a new career as an advocate for senior rights and financial security. The presentations were energizing, connecting me with other seniors who'd faced similar challenges and with younger people working to protect elderly family members. The most important thing I learned, I told one audience of social workers and law enforcement officers, is that predators rely on seniors feeling isolated and helpless. But we're not helpless if we stay connected to our communities, trust our instincts, and refuse to let anyone shame us into accepting treatment we know is wrong. The applause was gratifying, but the real reward came from individual conversations after the presentations. Seniors who'd been questioning their own judgment gained confidence to resist manipulation. Adult children learned to recognize warning signs of exploitation. Professional caregivers developed better protocols for protecting their elderly clients. As I approached my 67th birthday, I reflected on how dramatically my life had changed since Walter's death and my move to Pine Ridge. The solitary grief that had initially motivated my relocation had been transformed into purposeful engagement with community and family. Sarah and the children were permanent residents of Pine Ridge, now living in a house she'd purchased 2 miles from the cabin. Our daily contact provided the family connection I'd missed since Walter's death, while maintaining the independence that remained essential to my sense of self. Mom, do you ever regret buying this place and going through everything with Brad? Sarah asked during one of our evening walks along the mountain trails. Never, I replied without hesitation. That cabin saved my life in ways I didn't even realize I needed. It gave me a place to grieve Walter, a reason to fight for my future, and a foundation for building new relationships. The question that had motivated my entire journey remained constant. How do we age with dignity, purpose, and autonomy while remaining connected to people who love us? The answer I'd learned was by refusing to accept anyone else's definition of what our lives should look like. Brad's attempt to steal my future had ultimately strengthened it beyond anything I could have achieved alone. Fighting his scheme had connected me to community resources, legal protections, and advocacy opportunities that enriched my retirement immeasurably. His effort to isolate and diminish me had resulted in expanded influence and deeper relationships. As the sun set behind the mountain peaks on another peaceful evening at the cabin, I poured a glass of wine and settled into the porch swing Walter and I had dreamed of sharing during retirement. The silence was complete, except for the gentle sounds of evening birds and wind through pine needles. My phone buzzed with a text message from Emma. "Grandma, can we plant sunflowers in your garden tomorrow? Mom says they grow really tall in the mountains." The simple request filled me with joy. These were the moments that made the struggle worthwhile. Grandchildren who felt safe asking for what they wanted, a daughter rebuilding her life with courage and determination, and a future filled with possibilities rather than fears. I typed back, "Of course, sweetheart. We'll plant enough sunflowers to fill the whole valley with sunshine." As I prepared to go inside and plan tomorrow's gardening project, I thought about the question I wanted to ask you, the people who've listened to my story. Have you ever had to stand up to someone who tried to make you feel powerless or invisible? Whether it's a family member, an employer, a neighbor, or anyone else who thinks they can push you around because of your age, gender, or circumstances, how did you find the courage to fight back? And what did that experience teach you about your own strength? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments below. Your experiences might help other people recognize that they're not alone when facing bullies or manipulators. Please like this story if it reminded you of your own inner strength. Subscribe if you'd like to hear more stories about people who refuse to be victims, and share this with anyone who needs to remember that age and kindness don't mean weakness. Thank you for listening to my journey from retired teacher to mountain hermit to elder rights advocate. I hope my story encourages you to trust your instincts, protect your boundaries, and never let anyone convince you that you're too old, too alone, or too naive to fight for what's rightfully yours. May you always have the courage to defend your dreams and the wisdom to recognize when someone's trying to steal them. Until next time, keep standing tall and taking up the space you deserve in this world.